Next, I will invite on stage our panelists, two behemoths in their respective fields. I'll invite them to come right up so I can introduce them to you. So we have, oh, there we go. Have a seat. My apologies, ladies and gentlemen. Me and the jingle are clearly not friends today. So, because my intros were rudely interrupted by a jingle, let me hop back on board and introduce our esteemed panelists here. We have Clover Hogan here, who is serving some water. She is a 24-year-old climate activist and the founding executive director of Force of Nature, a youth not-for-profit mobilizing mindsets for climate action. She has worked alongside the world's leading authorities on sustainability, consulted within boardrooms of Fortune 50, not 500, 50 companies, if I understood correctly, and counseled heads of state. Her TED Talk, What to Do When Climate Change Feels Unstoppable, has been viewed 2 million times. Next to her, we have Christopher Guérin. Christopher Guérin is the CEO of Nexans, a leading global company in the cable and optical fiber industry. For the past 4 years since he's been CEO, Mr. Guérin has made a major strategic change in the group to reposition it in the markets as the leading player for sustainable electrification of the world. In this time, Nexans has quadrupled its market capitalization and doubled its profitability without relying on volume growth. That is quite an accomplishment. The company has done this by focusing deeply on climate issues and what he calls the E3 business model, which places equal parts attention to people, planet, and profit. Please give a round of applause to our wonderful panelists. So, I'm thinking that some of the people who saw your names on the program today saw, the head of a climate movement and the head of a major electrical company and thought that maybe they'd be coming here to see a boxing match. In fact, I don't think that's the case. I have heard Mr. Guérin's team, you allowed me to call you Chris, Chris's team call him the CEO activist, and you have activist right in your title. I'm curious, are you both just activists moving in the same direction but maybe from different angles? What would you say?
I think activism looks many different ways, and the number of people in this room today is testament to that fact. I think we can recognize at this point in time that we can't solve this crisis with one particular approach or method or type of person. We need the activists who are out in the streets, who are holding politicians to account, who are gluing themselves to buildings. And we also need, the people in the boardroom, negotiators, policymakers, who are working, across both sides, so to speak. And I will caveat that and say that I think as a movement, we have to find what accountability really, really looks like. And we have to interrogate what the most effective methods are for change. Within the climate movement, there's been a lot of debate over the past few years as to, for example, whether fossil fuels should have a seat at the table. And I find, a very good friend and someone who, if she had a poster, I would have had it on my bedroom wall growing up because I found her so inspiring, Christiana Figueres, who was formerly the Secretary General of the UNFCCC, the key negotiator for the Paris Agreement. She herself was one of these individuals who really lobbied for having, fossil fuels at the table, right? She recognized that we need the resources and, power and everything else that they have in order to solve this issue. And yet what's really interesting, as I'm sure some of you know, last year Christiana actually turned around and said I was wrong. And in the context of what we've seen over the past few years, when we've seen, in 2022, fossil fuel companies, the 5 biggest companies, make a record-breaking $200 billion in profit, when we've seen the CEOs, double, triple, quadruple their personal salaries, when we've seen, hundreds of thousands of people pushed into fuel poverty and dying, from heat in the summer and cold in the winter, unable to afford their energy bills, I think we can recognize that these companies are not going to volunteer to do the right or just or responsible thing. So I say all of that to say that, yes, I think we need a diversity of perspectives and we need to expand our definition of activist. And we also have to ensure that we hold accountable anyone who is bold enough to take that title. And with that, I mean, I'd be really curious to hear from your experience, Chris, because you are on the inside, but I think also as a CEO, you're probably in a much more difficult and perhaps even compromised position when you're having to manage, being accountable to directors and shareholders, and also try and do what you think is the ethically just and responsible thing.
On the financial markets as well. Thank you, Clover. Yeah, I will say that if being an activist is to say that we need to change the system, not the planet, yes, I'm an activist. That's for sure. I think, fully agree with you, Clover. I think we need two types of activists. The one that is able to convey through million people, amplify, I will say, a motto to say it's time to change. Our planet is burning, and this is what Clover is doing greatly. But you have other kind of activists, like I consider to be, at a different scale, which are inside the vortex, inside the matrix. We are inside, we are a listed company, fronting every day investors on the financial market that keep telling you, keep growing. And you need to change that. So it's at a different scale, but we try to find a way to reconfigure, I would say, the component of a very old system. We have a motto in Nexans that it's not from me, we are in France, Clover, so we love Voltaire. And Voltaire saying, in French, and I will give you the English translation after, dans une avalanche, aucun flocon ne se sent responsable. In an avalanche, no snowflake pleads guilty. We are all snowflakes. We are all a form of responsibility, whatever the size of the revenue, whatever is the role. So yes, we try to find a way, it was 5 years ago, to reconfigure the way we were doing profit, but for good, means not detrimental to the planet. And this is what we have been able to do with our model, but I will talk about it a bit later, which how to converge the priorities around economics, environment, and as well engagement. And yes, we are very proud with the team to been able to triple our profitability and reduce our carbon footprint by 40% in just 5 years, and without volumic growth and with a very strong engagement. And I will just conclude with these small introductions to say that 5 years ago, when I say that we need to grow profit because we don't want to be detrimental to the planet, so we'll do it without growth. Most of investors told me, it's impossible, you need growth, you need volume, you need more and more volume to keep growing because growth makes profit. And my answer at that time say, the impossible is just temporary. We find a way.
I love that. What I'm hearing here is two different people approaching their own sphere of influence in the best way that they possibly can, that you're bringing your sense of responsibility and shifting change and creating change in the systems around you, essentially. Systems change is this massive, massive topic, most of which I think many of us probably have no idea how to even begin to change a system, how to begin to even, influence something. I'm curious, in your respective fields, how are you approaching systems change? What have you found to be effective? Like, what buttons are you pushing to, to hit success?
Well, the climate crisis is ultimately a symptom of many broken systems, from the clothes we wear to the food we eat to who we elect into power and how we elect them there, or frankly, even how businesses generate value and where their responsibility lies. And we heard that in the previous session, whether their responsibility lies to a handful of shareholders or to the planet's billions of stakeholders. And so the climate crisis is a product of those broken systems. Now, when it comes to narrative change, the topic of today's panel, a lot of my focus as an advocate, as an activist, has been around how do we change some of the narratives around where responsibility lies for the climate crisis, in terms of who created the climate crisis, but also how we navigate our way out of it. And something that I spoke to on the ChangeNOW stage last year was this idea of, individual kind of actions and how they've really been corrupted and co-opted by corporations to misplace responsibility. You know, I remember what a revelation it was when I learned that it was BP, which was British Petroleum, which then rebranded to Beyond Petroleum, who created the carbon footprint calculator. And it was an ingenious tool to shine the spotlight away from themselves and onto the individual. And just 2 weeks ago, you know, the CEO of ExxonMobil came out and said, do you know what, solving climate change, we're not denying that it's not a thing anymore, which we spent tens of years and billions of dollars doing, but we're saying that it's actually not our responsibility, it's the responsibility of the individual. And so one of the most important narratives that I'm trying to change is this shift of obsession from individual actions in terms of, you know, turning off the lights when you leave a room and buying your reusable coffee cup and going vegetarian, all of which are, you know, might make you feel great on an individual level and might help you live in a more values-aligned way. But to actually expanding that focus and saying, sure, that's nice, but when we're talking about systems change, we have to talk about massive institutional change. You know, we have to talk about systems of power. And so my invitation for people is to look beyond the individual and toward the collective. And we can see the evidence of this throughout history. If we look at every people-powered movement, you know, Martin Luther King was referenced in the last session. You know, he was an incredible change maker. But let's not forget that he was part of a movement of hundreds of thousands of people who made up the civil rights movement. Same for the suffragettes, same for Black Lives Matter, you know, same for Fridays for the Future. And so I actually think it's much more empowering if we don't do ourselves a disservice of saying, all I can do is change what's happening in my personal life, to actually, what does it look like for us to work together in collective? And so that, for me, is really the narrative and the story that I want people to get behind, so that then, you know, to your question, we can think about our sphere of influence, right? How do I exert my influence, not just in my immediate life, my friends and family, but in the world at large?
Thank you.
Yeah, on the management perspective, you know, we are in a very, very complex world. You know, I would say there is three main pillars. The first one is that as managers, we are facing what I call the paradoxal injunction. Sometimes we talk about growth, sometimes we talk about profit, one day we talk about environment, sometimes we talk about social inequalities, and another day sometimes we talk about infinite resources on constrained resources. So every day, depending on the wind, you are facing paradoxal injunctions that you need to manage. In parallel to that, the third issue is that we are living in a perma-crisis world, where the crises are not in sequence anymore. They are piling up. Either we are talking about climate crisis, sanitary crisis, geopolitical crisis, economical crisis, and social crisis. We are facing all that crisis at the same time. And the third element, and it's maybe a European angle, is we have an obsession of indicators. We try that we will save the planet by indicators. So we receive thousands of indicators. We need regulation, but please do not believe that we save the planet by indicators. So this is what we are facing every day. So how to get out of it? You know, I think there is a matter of education. We are opposing sometimes generation together. I think it's not a question of generation, it's a matter of education. I was in front of 500 students recently. I read the book that they just read a few months ago. The book have not changed. The business book have not changed. They are still glued in the old systems. Show me a book that tells you that degrowth can make profit. Show me a book that tells you that 80% of your customers can be moved away. And show me your books that tell you that less is better. There's none. There is none. So I think that's the way. It's all a matter of education. Whatever your age, we need to learn to unlearn, and we need to rethink the model we are in. So that's the main topic for the managers of today. Thank you.
It's actually a little bit ironic that I know you didn't do this in a self-promotional way at all, but Chris mentioned that, you know, show me a book where the system is changed, and there's a different outline of how you can do business differently. He happened to have written that book. It's called Finding Our Way Again. He did not ask me to do this. I have dug into this book now. My fiance is nose deep in it as well. Super, super recommend if you want to look at a different way of doing business, one where people and the environment are truly at the same parallel as profit, that those three things are equally important. Really, really great read. Books aside, We have a few more minutes together here, and I know that we have a captivated audience, people who came here surely to try to make differences in sort of the world around them. I suspect that a lot of the people here are already among the converted, and what I mean by that is whenever we're facing something that is broken, there are always people who think, this thing is broken, I agree, let's fix it, okay? I suspect that's most of us here. But then there are two other categories of people. People who are looking at the system and saying, it's not broken, there's nothing to fix here, actively opposing any sort of change, so let's call those the opposition. And then there's also often this sort of silent majority of people, people who are maybe trying to figure out where they stand, how they can possibly act. Like, these are people who are not necessarily taking action yet. I'm curious, can you tell us how we might go and convince category 2 and 3 people that there is a problem that needs fixing? How do we change that narrative? How do we influence other people to understand, I guess, what we're starting to understand here or have understood here for quite some time? Advice, tips?
We could probably speak on this for a few hours, to be honest. I've spent much of my career as an activist since the age of 11, started young, understanding climate denial. When I first learned about the climate crisis, I was overwhelmed by feelings of grief and anger and frustration, powerlessness. But I think more than anything else, I remember feeling really confused. I couldn't understand how I hadn't learned about the climate crisis in school, why I hadn't seen it on the TV when my parents watched the news, why we didn't talk about it at the dinner table. And so I became obsessed with this idea of, why is it that the adults in my life are so good at sleepwalking, even when all of the evidence, all of the science shows that we're hurtling toward this cliff of climate and ecological collapse? What I've learned in the years since is that the most insidious form of climate denial is it's just not happening, because actually that is now the minority. It is the belief that incremental solutions that fail to go to the root of the crisis will genuinely address the problem and lead to a more fair and equitable world. And this is the thing that really worries me, because I know that some solutions are kind of treated as these silver bullet solutions, and they get a disproportionate amount of airtime. I think of electric vehicles, for example. How much have we heard about EVs over the past few years? Now, looking at EVs, to take that example, the explosion in EVs has also led to an explosion in cobalt, right? It's a material needed to make EV batteries. The majority of the world's cobalt is produced in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And we've seen an explosion in human rights abuses, in child labor, in absolutely horrifying working conditions for the people who are mining this material. And we see the quote-unquote global north looking the other way. And so we have to be very, very careful when talking about climate solutions that we're not inadvertently doubling down or perpetuating deeply entrenched injustice and human rights abuses in pursuing solutions that don't actually go to the root of the crisis. Because if we look at EVs, let's take a step back. We're not actually talking about, how do we change the combustible engine? We're talking about how do we redesign and rethink mobility? And that's a much more exciting question, because then we can talk about, all right, what are transport solutions that are accessible to the majority? How do we redesign our cities? If we made cities less car-friendly, they'd actually be much greener. The average car spends 98% of its life parked. Imagine if we used all of that parking space to create local food systems, to build playgrounds, to make cities more resilient so that they're not this hot, because it feels like a greenhouse in here, during the summer months. And so my invitation to people is to really think about how do we actually create more fair and equitable societies, and how is sustainability a means to that end? And to your question, I think that is a way to connect with people no matter where they fall on the kind of climate spectrum, because it's ultimately about how do we make better lives for everyone, and how do we do that by actually rewriting systems of inequality built on the oppression of the vast majority of people, built on a history of colonization, and built on the commodification of nature. Because frankly, we can do so much better, and all of the solutions that are presented here at ChangeNOW are testament to exactly that.
Chris, how would you approach the category 2s and 3s, the non-believers? And I'm sure, actually, knowing about your history since being CEO, you must have had some substantial pushback from your shareholders, from your board, when you implemented some of these massive changes. How did you push through that? What did you tell people along the way?
Specifically, I will say that we have some pushback when we say that we need to get rid of 80% of our customer base.
That's a lot.
That was. So I would say that I think we need to learn from the Chinese philosophy and sometimes to turn a crisis into an opportunity, and we did it during COVID time. I will make it short, but we call all our managers and we say, dear managers, we are entering in a very systemic crisis. A sanitary crisis will generate a revenue crisis. A revenue crisis will generate a profit crisis. If you are lacking profit, you will lacking cash. If you are lacking cash, you will have to fire your people. Do you want to fire your people? No, obviously. So we say, let's manage cash. Okay, that was I would say, the profit view. But what we do is that we say, now it's time to do in 4 months, with a very courageous way, what we aim to do for the next 4 years. Let's do it right now. Let's remove 80% of our customer base. Let's focus only on 4,000 customers upon 17,000. The ones that are good for our profit, because we are a listed company. So, you know, if I'm a kind of CEO that tell you, oh, I put environment first and profit comes after, my lifetime will be very limited as a CEO, few weeks. So we need to find a way where we can converge the profitability with the environment. And this is what we did. We profile each individual customer, making sure they're doing great in terms of our future, but as well very, very good in terms of our ability to reduce the carbon employed to serve them. And you know, it's like your example, Clover, when you say local for local, we stop any business for all our 45 factories around the world, beyond 800 miles away from the point of production. We say, you have to produce locally, local for local. You are in China for China, we are in France for France, whatever. You have to play local. So that they understood that. It's very well known in US. I don't know why it's not so known in Europe, that this complexity reduction, the fact that you focus on less customers, less product, we remove 40% of our product, show that there is a model in the model and that you can make profit. So what we've done now is that we have our E3 model, and we impose a kind of carbon quota for each individual factories. You say, you need to increase profit on one side because our profit is the jobs of tomorrow and is the investment of tomorrow. But in the meantime, you have to reduce your carbon quota by 10%. The fact that they have a double constraints, both on improving profit on one hand and reducing their carbon employ, they need to find a way to choose the business and the customer that will fit on both. So we try to make that emerging. It takes a lot of time, but at least what we have been able to do in 5 years show that you don't need growth to change your model and to make your profit and even make happy your investors. Because sometimes I'm a bit worried about, I'm just coming from another show in the industry where they are to keep talking about growth. And I was in US recently, and there is an investor that told me, he said, Chris, recession is in front of us, so back to basic, back to profit. I say, no. We cannot go back to just profit. We have a legacy as CEO. You have a legacy as an investor to find a way that the three together, the profit, the people, and the planet, converge in the same direction. It's a long way, but as I told you, I'm inside the vortex. I'm inside the matrix. So, to convey this message every day to investors needs to keep repeating constantly and with a very high level of conviction. If not, you're dead.
So what I'm gathering from everything that we've shared here today, that you've shared with us, is a few different things. First of all, do what you can with what you have where you are. If you're the CEO of a company, make radical changes within that company. If you're a climate activist, if you're a global citizen, mobilize. do what needs to get done. And I think I'm also hearing that it is really important to bring other people on board in different ways and sometimes tell a story that isn't particularly likable and trust that people will come along, that there is a bit of risk sometimes in being bold and audacious. And there will be pushback, like Andrew told us in our keynote speech, right? The fact that there is pushback is an indication that you might be moving in the right direction. So I want to thank you. That's all the time that we have today. Please give our panelists a big round of applause. This is very insightful.